Okay, it's recording. Mark, presenter's choice. How's that?
Okay, well, I can go first. Didn't take too long. Let's see. I've got a slide deck. Find it. Made it this morning, so hopefully it shouldn't be too hard for me to find. Okay, is slides coming through?
Yes, there are.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so thank you for inviting me here today to talk to you about a SCIM profile that I had been working on a couple of years ago, and I think it might be relevant to some of the work you're looking at doing for potential rechartering or just for continuing to write more things about SCIM. So here's the scenario that I've seen a lot of people interested in. There's an organization that has people, and that organization is using two apps. I'll use standard, old school terminology from SAML because I know that, but the idea is there's two apps. One app has some information about different people, and there's another app that wants to make use of it. And so if your scenario is, hey, I've got an identity provider and I want to use that to log in and send claims to another identity provider, great. We have lots of ways of doing that. SAML, OAuth, OpenID Connect, that's a pretty well solved problem. A lot of people are doing that. And then they say, well, that's good. And also what I want is some kind of cache consistency. So that relying party app B, not only do I want users to be able to sign into it, representing different people with different claims, but I also want to make sure that if there's updates, I bring some person 2 in, or person 1 goes out of scope, or person 1 changes their name or phone number, that if application B on the right is either caching that information or has other things that are linked to that person, that information gets updated. So classic example is if I'm holding data about different people and they're representing, let's say, employees of an organization or students of a school, and someone leaves their organizational affiliation, I'd like to go and clean up their data in the different applications. That person is never going to be single signing in or logging into that application again with that organization identity. So I need some way other than the single sign-on protocol to go and clean it up. Now, various people have proposed solutions for that in the past. There's extensions to SAML, various other protocols for doing that there, but I guess haven't seen a lot of wide adoption of those. However, when SCIM got started, a lot of people said, oh, that's a great problem that could be solved with SCIM.
Hey,
So,
Mark, sorry
yeah.
to interrupt you. Quick question. Is the knowledge that application B has about the user or the person, is it obtained because they logged in and copied the claims? Or do you think that that application will have already known about the user because it had some other knowledge about them through another protocol like SCIM or whatever?
Great question. And I see both. So one scenario that I hear from some developers of application B is I need to have some record for a person prior to them being able to single sign on. I won't allow them to just show up with some claims if there is not already some account for them. So they have a need for things like tell me about a new person so that then when that person later tries to sign in through SAML or OpenID Connect, I'm ready to say, aha, I already know about person 2 and their organizational affiliation, so they're allowed to single sign on. So that is one use case. Another use case is what people historically have called the SAML JIT. The initial creation of the user is triggered in the relying party application by the user signing in. But that any subsequent updates of, oh, and now the user has changed their name or their phone number, or the user is just never coming back, that would be something that needs to be addressed using something like SCIM.
Right. Okay. I just was wanting to point out that I think this scenario exists in both cases, whether you created the account in the application B because you copied claims or because you had prior knowledge. I think this is still a problem.
Yes, I agree. Both cases have that problem. So the challenge that I've seen is SCIM has started to become popular. And so oftentimes in different application development teams, someone will go to the engineers and say, go write SCIM. And that engineer will correctly go to the IETF, download the SCIM RFCs, and start adding SCIM to the app. The problem that I have observed, however, is two applications that are independently told developers go add SCIM, they don't necessarily implement the same or complementary SCIM capabilities. So the worst case scenario is they both build SCIM clients or they both build SCIM servers, and so you can't have two clients talking to each other. That's the worst case. What's much more common is each one made different assumptions for what aspects of SCIM they needed to do. So when talking to a number of different application developers, I saw some common patterns. The first one is that the SCIM RFCs are, as intended, covering many, many scenarios, not just the scenario I've talked about here, but other cases as well. Like the user themselves can create an account, or things for device to device, or just things outside of this realm. And so it's open to lots of different ways to choose to implement it. And that when you give an implementer a choice, they are time or resource constrained, as are most of us. And so we'll choose one option. If SCIM says, well, you could be a SCIM server or a SCIM client, they may choose to just build either a SCIM client or a SCIM server and not both. Or they may say, well, it's not clear how to do authentication. I'll just pick some way of doing it. And then all the things that SCIM states as optional or may, some will choose to do it, some won't. And so it's not always clear what they need to do and when they should stop and declare success. I also see a challenge where there's many standardization venues going on and many groups defining protocols. In the old days, it was easy. It was ITU and ISO or IETF. And so if you were coming to IETF from ITU or ISO, you kind of had to go and learn the IETF lingo and ways of doing things. Now we see people coming from OASIS, coming from having read OpenID foundations, like other areas of standardization protocol design, where this might be the first IETF spec. SCIM might be the first thing that they've read and had to go implement. And so we want to be, I would say, encouraging for them to then do the right thing. Some of the challenges I've seen with the implementers is if they have not been doing IETF spec implementations for years, they may not know things that were kind of behind the scenes assumption. Well, everyone knows to be liberal in what you accept. Others may say, well, the ABNF said that this field was a lowercase a, and I know that people are going to try to do fuzzing security attacks. So if you send an uppercase a, then I'm going to reject that. It's like, well, yeah, you could reject it, but that's not really helping interoperability. But you get an A for effort. Also, things like may. May is a very interesting word, and in 2119 it talks about what does may mean for interoperability. We use may a lot in the RFCs. And so if the implementer is reading may and thinks, oh, may means it's optional, I just get to choose whether or not I do it at each of these over 100 branching points, the odds that any two implementers would pick the exact same set of which mays they want to do and which they don't is very low. So what do I propose we do about this? Well, first of all, I think SCIM, as it stands today as an RFC, while there's certainly things we could do to improve the base SCIM profile or sorry, protocol and schema, I think in addition we need to have a document, I suggest an RFC, that profiles how should application developers of application A or application B think about SCIM. How should they use SCIM? Because I see this scenario of building this kind of application, this use case for SCIM, as being so common that I'd like it to be more cookie cutter. If you are building, let's say, an identity provider application or have one today and you want to implement SCIM, you should build a SCIM client. And you should do the following things, like when a user is added, you should go communicate with relying party applications in the following way. And similarly, what the payload looks like should be made a little bit more prescriptive. SCIM, of course, gives you lots of options, and I see a lot of challenges in payload processing when, let's say, application B gets its first post request from an application A that's never talked to before. Like so many early interoperability exercises, usually BOGIS end up rejecting it because it wasn't expecting exactly that payload. So I think we need to be more specific on what must a relying party or an identity provider allow, what must it emit, and then just kind of reduce the number of mays or options that it needs to consider in this scenario. Now, it's not to say that SCIM can't allow that, and certainly there'll be other use cases where you'd say, well, I want to use SCIM for my device-to-device communication, and that I needed to do something else. That's fine. This is why I think this is a profile of SCIM, saying if you're implementing this scenario, here's what your implementation must or should do. And then to list explicitly, here are all the things that you would need to then agree upon between these two implementations. So, for example, simple stuff like, well, what's the URL of your SCIM server, or how do you authenticate from the identity provider SCIM client to that server? Things that you just can't put into the spec itself, but you want to have a list of those so that when someone is thinking about, okay, I've built my SCIM server, now how do I go find a SCIM client to go talk to, or vice versa, there's a list of what are all the things that you would need to then do. I made a first cut, or actually it's a second cut of this, in an internet draft. The draft has now expired, but if you go to the IETF website, you can, of course, still find it there. Basically, what I've tried to put into this internet draft is three kinds of things. Statements that were addressing interoperability problems that I had seen with different applications. Things like case sensitivity versus insensitivity. Someone says, I'm only allowing a lowercase a because the ABNF had a lowercase a, and the other implementer said, well, why? Why is it that you're doing that? The spec didn't say that only lowercase was allowed, so we want to go and make sure there isn't any ambiguity there. Guidance for things like multi-tenant. Oftentimes, these identity providers or relying parties may be holding data on behalf of multiple organizations. SCIM didn't really go into much detail about how that works, so that's worthwhile calling out. Overlapping requests, simple things like, well, if I have 10,000 new students showing up at an identity provider, how do I get those 10,000 new students into the relying party? Or at the end of the semester, how do I take them out? Do I have one HTTP connection and just simply send 10,000 requests one after the other? Do I open 10,000 HTTP connections and try to get as many as I can? Like, how do I throttle? What do I do with errors? Things like this, because oftentimes we'd see situations where one identity provider had said, I'm building an identity provider that is internet scale, and if you can't handle 10,000 simultaneous requests, well, then you're obviously not doing things right. And another relying party had said, well, I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting you to send me like maybe one connection at a time and maybe one request a second. Don't try to overlap or throttle or parallelize, otherwise I'll throttle. Schema requirements. So there's lots of things in the SCIM user profile that is, certainly a lot of very interesting attributes, but it's not always clear if anyone has actually implemented all of those beyond things like the ID attribute. And there's a number of considerations that people were taking on things like the ID attribute. Oh, the ID is always a GUID. Why? Well, the identity provider or the relying party I was working with was always sending back a GUID. Well, that doesn't mean it's always a GUID. It just means that one happened to queue as a GUID. And if your client was assuming the idea of getting back was a GUID, you would be very surprised the first time you got back a non-GUID ID. And then as mentioned before, what are the operations that an identity provider would be expected to send? Because there's not always a one-to-one match. You might, for example, want to query whether a user exists before creating them, or read the current properties of a user before updating them. These are common patterns that I think were worth calling out, even though they weren't part of the SCIM RFCs, because we see these patterns over and over. Now, as said before, this draft has timed out. It's expired. We can bring it back if relevant. There are still some open questions that I think we should be looking at in the future. One is about reconciliation. So to come back to cache consistency, in the earlier diagram, we stated the scenario was the identity provider had information it wanted to send to the relying party and keep up to date. We also see situations where the relying party is also itself updating some of those properties. Okay, I sent over that Mark's favorite color is green, but in the relying party it got changed to red. Should the identity provider be allowed to check in with the relying party and said, hey, is Mark's favorite color still green, or has something changed over there? Service-to-service authentication. Authentication is just not my strength. And I know there's a lot of work currently going on both in the ITF and elsewhere around best practices for service-to-service authentication. So I think that's an area that could be added to clarify how does an identity provider authenticate itself to a relying party, particularly in circumstances where there is multi-tenant. So if Contoso and Lidware are two organizations, they're both using the same identity provider and the same relying party applications, unaware of each other, how should the identity provider authenticate itself to the relying party and vice versa? Should it do it as, hi, I'm the identity provider, or should it do it as, hi, I'm the identity provider and I'm acting in the context of Contoso, so that when someone's looking at, let's say, the audit trail, they can then correlate which organization they're acting on behalf of. I see pluses and minuses either way, but I think it'd be good to nail down what the best practice is. And then finally, relationship with FastFed. So there's work going on outside of the ITF in, I believe, OpenID Foundation to go and standardize the establishment of protocol connections between different applications. So a related problem to this of how do I go and credential that this identity provider and this relying party are then authorized to communicate through whether OpenID Connect or SCIM or other protocols for Contoso, and then separately for Lidware. And that would obviously have implications on this work stream. So if there is a liaison that we wish to establish with OpenID Foundation or with other parties, it might be relevant to look at perhaps bringing some of their work into the ITF, or to be able to reference out from any ITF work to the work that they're doing. Okay, that is the end of my presentation. So please, if you are interested in this, take a look at the expired draft, and definitely interested to get any comments or feedback on that. Again, it's not intended to be a ready to go because there are still these open questions, but I think it'd be a worthwhile topic for further discussion in the working group if we decide to recharter.
This is great. Thank you, Mark. With regard to fast federation and service-to-service authentication, that's actually something that FastFed tries to suggest. It can't require, but it's using one of the RFCs I forget which one off the top of my head now, that lets each side self-sign, create their own assertion, and just during the initial handshake, each side agrees, okay, yes, this is the signing key I expect to see from you going forward. So it's a very clean and simple authentication mechanism for service to service. So FastFed did see that challenge and attempted to suggest a solution to it.
Great.
Do you
Any
have-
other comments or questions? Oh, sorry. Yes.
Question about eventing. So one of the solutions we've seen for certainly Active Directory implements this, and lots of other folks do, is when an object changes, it can emit a webhook that the other side receives. And SCIM doesn't have an event model. There was another draft, I think Phil did it on SCIM events, that I think was along those same lines, being able to emit a webhook event for a receiver that accelerates the cache coherency protocol, so it's not a scheduled reaggregation of the entire list, just looking for single changes. I'm not sure where that landed, if that's still in our backlog.
I second that interest in that, Matt, because I think the solution that Mark just proposed and proposes in the RFC is that the identity provider would act as a client and the application as a server, which is certainly a way to handle that same scenario where you would otherwise use an event. I think that they're a solution to the same problem. If we have events, then the identity provider doesn't necessarily need to be a client to the relying party. The relying party could just receive the events from the identity provider. And I don't know which ones would be best, but certainly interested in knowing what the community thinks. You know, which, as an identity provider implementer, which of those would I rather implement? Or as an application provider, which would I rather implement?
So having written a SCIM client, I would say that if the goal here was to create a standard protocol, a standard profile to solve this problem, if we can solve the problem by saying that the IDP is always the client and the relying party is always the server, and eliminate the need to have to implement a eventing webhook extension, that would be my preference, probably both as the client developer and the server developer, because we can solve that problem without having to support the eventing thing. Now, there may be other use cases and other interesting reasons why we would need eventing, and maybe that's a different profile. But my thought would be that if we could solve the problem without eventing, then that would probably be the way to go, because from a development perspective, the hours and costs required to develop it and support it would be lower.
Okay. I would just propose that maybe we take Mark's invitation to discuss the draft as an opportunity to see what interest there is on events versus clients and servers. Sounds like there would maybe be opinions on both sides of that argument. I'll certainly send an email to the list if that's the right place to discuss this with our preference.
Yeah, I think that'd be really good, because again, I've seen both situations of a identity provider acting as a SCIM server and then asking for relying party applications. Oh, just query my database via SCIM, and you can pull back any users you want. Then needing, of course, an eventing mechanism by and this user has got a new phone number through eventing, versus the approach that I profiled of the other pattern where the identity provider being the SCIM client that Jeremy also mentioned then means that the identity provider doesn't need to be, I would say, always online from this perspective. It can simply say when and if there is a event of interest, then it can choose to notify the relying party applications, but does not have to. I think both, there are definitely pluses and minuses for both, and there's circumstances where you might say one would be a better fit for the other. In the case of, let's say, I've got a school district and I've got 100,000 students in it, but only 3 students ever want to use this application, it would not be effective to send everyone to a relying party, perhaps having the relying party query, that would make sense. But in other cases where, and I've heard this one also, I want to be able to talk about everyone in my relying party application. So perhaps in my relying party application, there's some user experiences, say, I'll take a simple case. Trouble ticketing. There's a trouble ticketing application, and within the relying party, I can assign a trouble ticket to anyone. So some trouble ticket applications may say, well, I'll just turn around and make an LDAP or SCIM call to the identity provider in that case to get the list of everyone. Others say, no, I have my own database, and so I need to keep my database within my relying party application up to date, because for whatever performance reasons, I need to have my own local cache of like all the users that I'm talking about.
Okay.
Okay.
I think that's, I guess, a general invitation to everyone on the call to just go ahead and email the list with their thoughts about the problem space, which is, is events more effective, or is the the client server relationship more preferred? Maybe keep track of what we hear from that. Like, I guess I'm just trying to figure out a way that we can see what the dominant opinion is.
We could make this a topic, like dedicate time in these calls as a topic, so we could come to a would the group be interested in that?
I would.
I think I would. I just need a little time to digest.
So I have a more general question about this draft and its goals. I have been involved in some of these standards processes, mostly as an interested customer and implementer, and not really as somebody who does a lot of contributing and development of the standard itself. So it sounds to me like Mark's goal by creating, say, SCIM Profile 1, which is this is how the SCIM community thinks that identity providers and applications who need to keep close consistency in their data sources at a frequency shorter than the amount of time it takes users to log in and update their data through JIT. Let's say we call this SCIM Profile 1, and sometime down the road we'll have another set of best practices or guidance, and we'll call that SCIM Profile 2, right? So my understanding from Mark's kind of presentation is that without this kind of profile, we end up with developers on both sides of this problem often implementing different solutions that don't work together. Makes perfect sense to me. My question is kind of what's the history or what's the experience in the standards group of like how hard it is to develop and get one of these profiles out there? And then once the profile's out there, do we see a lot of adoption and it's really worth it? And we see good traction both for the profile and the underlying technology? Or does it happen that we spend time developing a profile and put it out there and then nobody goes and implements that profile? Kind of what's the bang for the buck for actually doing this work to develop this best practice and publish it as a profile?
So I have an opinion here. This is Pam, but I'm sure other people have way more experience here. I mean, there's no guarantee of anything. It's very easy for us to generate a draft. I mean, if this interest group gets together and generates a draft, we can submit the draft. We don't need a chartered working group for all of that, right? Where the adoption comes in is in how well we, as an industry, telegraph that that's the requirement, right? So it's sort of it's an ecosystem play for us to make those profiles a step in doing business. Would you guys all agree with that, or is that a bridge too far?
One thing I'd add to that, just based on some of my other standardization experiences, that, as Pam said, it's easy to produce a profile from a merely technical mechanism. Sometimes it's been done in the auspices of ITF. Other times it's been done in other groups. For example, in days of LDAP, we had different interoperability groups that were tactically going and profiling this, how to use LDAP in higher education, how to use LDAP in, et cetera, et cetera. And some of those have come back in. So, for example, many of the LDAP schemas that are popularly deployed originated from earlier standardization activities, like iNet Person that was trying to solve, how do I use X500 in the internet and not have weird things like MHSOR addresses, which I know will bring back horrible memories to some people, but to have more useful attributes like RFC822 email addresses. So those have seen broad adoption that were originally a mirror profile of the standard. Another case that I've seen is that journey of, we take base profile X or base protocol X, and then we define profile X for use case 1, use case 2, etc. Then at a later date, when it comes time to reevaluate the progression of the base protocol towards full standardization status, because we're not yet there with SCIM, we often have found that having those profiles then guides what are the interoperable core elements that are best suited for revising the base protocol as it progresses into full standard status. Because the profile work streams would have indicated where it was that particular features were seeing adoption and therefore worthwhile to then include into the next revision of a standard. Whereas if, let's say, all the profiles said it's not relevant to have /me, no profile said we had a need for the /me path, then we could rightfully ask ourselves at the time for standardization, well, maybe that should move out of the core and be a option in a separate document because none of the common profiles had a requirement for that.
Thanks. I was just trying to get some understanding of, how successful we're likely to be if we, develop this profile and then, probably end up going on to develop a different profile for a different use case in terms of increasing the interoperability and success of the standard.
Does anyone else have some perspectives there?
Just as another example, the presentation that Paul and Matt Peterson did a few weeks ago on the SCIM PAM extension. SailPoint's been very successful with several of our partners in implementing that. We wrote the draft of the PAM extensions once and have been able to use that repeatedly with several partners now. Not that it meets all use cases, as Paul and Matt so eloquently showed us, but it was a good start for what we were trying to accomplish at the time. So I think, to Pam's point, having a draft is important, but working with your business side to get that implemented in your partnerships is equally as important.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is too obvious even to bother saying, but solution implementers like SailPoint and like my company Remediant, like Microsoft, are going to choose to implement the standard if it's easier than the alternative, which is making their own thing. So as long as we can make the standard easier than the alternative, then I think we'll see adoption. And if there is no need for the standard and or there is an easier alternative, then we may not. So I think our objective should make it as easy as possible for implementers to choose it over the alternatives.
So I know one of the other topics that was under consideration for the recharter was gathering interest points. I don't know what the current plan is, but was the idea about putting more guidance around soft deletes, right? So this is the case where the identity provider wants to delete the user, but the application or the relying party in Mark's case doesn't support deletion, or because of internal database consistency in his trouble ticketing example, they still need to reference that user even though they no longer exist within the identity provider because there's tickets that have history for that user, right? So would we think that adding sort of standardized patterns for soft deletes be a good thing to put into this profile if we decided we wanted to work on it?
Yeah, I would say that one thing if we decide to take on this work stream would be to look at what are the areas where, let's say as an identity provider or as a relying party, you have said, I wish the other developers of these other applications knew what I am trying to do here. Soft delete is one common pattern where you need to make sure that both sides of the protocol exchange are aware of what are the semantics of, let's say, patching a user to mark them as unable to sign in versus deleting the user, recreating user with the same ID as the previous user. Like these are things that have led to interoperability issues in the past, where I think it'd be good to then call out what is the expectation and to say either that there is either a single required behavior for all, let's say, relying parties, or to say this might be one area where the relying party and identity provider need to explicitly agree upon what is the behavior as just a list of things that is open to that community to do. So just make it explicit either way.
Yeah, I understand it. I had to implement SCIM on the server, and one of the things we don't do is delete an account. We can't do it, so we interpret a delete as just disable it. And whether or not the SCIM provider needs to know that is one of those questions that needs to be answered.
Yeah, Danny, the problem with that is what happens when the IDP comes back 60 days later and sends you the same email address or username with a different external ID, right? So you've disabled that account on your side, but the client now wants to create somebody with the same email address. That's where this whole idea that the identity provider needs to understand that that user doesn't exist, but needs to keep the record around. And I think standardizing that pattern would be extremely helpful because many identity providers like you don't actually delete records, but we need a way to coordinate with identity providers about what that means and what should happen on both sides when that happens.
Yeah, well, you could set it up so that when you specify a delete, it will come back and just say this is disabled. Mm-hmm. You can respond when you take some action, so the provider knows. Yeah, we had other issues related to auditing where we need to know whether something changed within the application, and we needed to notify the SCIM provider, but the identity provider, that something changed, which probably shouldn't have happened. And that's an audit consideration.
Hey, this is Vivek here from AWS, and I can attest to this particular point of confusion around deletion, soft deletion of users, and also issues related to, if not done properly, the identity provider accidentally reclaiming a deleted or disabled user for somebody else, and that we're running into security issues. So this is an area that we've seen trouble with, and definitely needs some guidance around how should both parties kind of act in when either soft delete has to be explicitly called out, or do we need some protections around this?
Well, I can tell you my implementation refused to re-enable an account that had been disabled. It would say, no, you can't do that. But that's probably not a standard response. So.
Yeah, exactly. So the recommendations around this would probably help us converge to a consistent behavior across all parties.
And I think if Mark's idea here is to make it easier and more likely to succeed for this pattern, that the soft deletes would be a key factor there, right? Because I've seen in every single implementation that I've done that this problem is addressed differently by the client and by the server. So I think if we were to give some good guidance on this, we'd probably be much more successful in our implementations, both as identity providers and as the application developers and resource providers.
So is there, I don't think Phil is on the call. I know Phil is a co-author with Morteza on the soft delete spec, like the actual draft that has already been submitted to IETF. Is there anyone here, we can contact Phil and see if he'll do a review for us. Is there anyone here who would like to either work with Phil or maybe take on that job of reviewing that draft and just putting together, some sense making for this group on how it works?
This is the soft delete draft?
Correct.
I'd be willing to look at it.
Yeah, so Pam, I mean, it's near and dear to this one, and the the idea of being able to pull the entire relying party database. So it's sort of this site that we call it like deltas, or how to get a full, and I don't know, I can't remember what the current term is on it. Those are two topics that are very near and dear to me, and all of these relate to this problem that Mark is showing here, which is how do we keep the app database or cache in tight consistency with the identity provider data. So I can certainly try to review the current draft of soft deletes, and also this other one about how do we, this data consistency one that I think has been going around for a while. I can't remember what the team's calling it. Because I think that those are key to making what Mark's trying to achieve more successful. And we can think about, should we just include that soft delete in this profile, or should this profile reference that other draft as one of the key requirements? We'd have to think about how that works.
Okay, so it sounds like if we were also, Quint, I see your comment in the chat too. So maybe we talk to Phil, Jeremy, Quint, and Danny if you're interested, and we'll, reconcile that and try and get that for our next meeting. The consistency piece, Jeremy, can you make sure that there's a list over in the chat also of the
let me see if I can pull it up real quick and tell you which one it is.
Okay, yeah, I just want to make sure that we don't lose that. It's not in the interest list, it should be, right?
It's the cursor pagination one, I think, is kind of what it is. Like, I need to pull the total user list from the relying party to make sure that all of the data there is consistent and repush any data that's gone in drift. And the only way to pull the entire thing is to get them to properly page over their data set, which a lot of loosely coupled relying parties don't like to do. So if we can't implement cursor paging, which is, as a client, what I would really like to have, we can maybe get some of our really smart members here to help think about a different way for the identity provider to identify drift in the application or relying party cache, and think about a way to trigger a repush for those users, right? So I think that if we're trying to keep those two systems closely coupled and in sync, we need to come up with some solution for that. So that's why I kind of mentioned it as another topic that might be good to include in this profile or to think about in this profile. I think
Jeremy,
that's Mark's thing here, maybe reconciliation of state in relying party with identity provider, right?
Yeah.
do you picture that as bidirectional or unidirectional changes in the IDP as authoritative?
Sure. So couple things, right? If we think about the pattern that Mark has proposed here, which is we've got the identity provider sitting as the client, and we've got the relying party application sitting as the server. The identity provider is basically picking up changes from the authoritative data source and pushing them to the relying party. I think in that pattern, we're really talking about authoritative data in the IDP and pushing that to the app cache. In the case where the application may be authoritative for certain things like last logon, or somebody mentioned I generated an audit event and I need to tell the IDP that there's something wrong. We could think about how to do that. If that might be a different profile, that might be a different top aspect of the profile that Mark proposed, but that's a little bit of a different thing because the idea here was that the IDP could be offline, it's not always available, and it's reaching out to the app when it thinks there's a change, right? That doesn't require this eventing thing to happen, but maybe the problem that you described where, hey, I'm the app and I've got to tell the IDP something really urgent, how do I keep this updated? Maybe that requires a different set of tools.
Yeah, I think that what we're trying to do is we're trying to come up with a way of talking about SCIM in the language of federation. Most application developers are able to determine what's an IDP and what's a relying party application, and trying to fit SCIM into that environment is really it's a common desire. Like if I'm developing a relying party application, what is it that I need to develop if I want a certain level of functionality? And if I'm developing an IDP, what is it that I need to be able to, what do I have to implement in order to have a certain level of functionality? The profiles that I think are interesting to people are the ones that apply to those two categories of application, because they're separate communities many times. And so I think that would be really interesting. If you're developing a relying party, you kind of know what you need to do with SAML or OpenID Connect or whatever it is with the federation protocols, but what should I do with SCIM? I think that's what Mark was actually trying to point out, is that I need a profile as a relying party application developer for what I need to develop with SCIM. Do I just develop a client, or do I also need to develop some server things in order to be able to receive change notifications? If I'm developing an IDP, am I just writing a server, or do I also have to develop a client so that I can receive requests from, or do I have to develop a client so that I can actually make requests to a relying party server?
Exactly.
So-
The developer just doesn't know when should they stop implementing SCIM. Like
That's
they could
right.
just keep implementing SCIM, but at some point there's like, this is the minbar of SCIM capabilities that we expect you as a implementer should implement for this scenario. And then if you do this, we'll suggest you'll get interoperability. Can't guarantee it, but it's likely if you do this, it'll be interoperable. You can keep going, of course, you can do more, but you should at least get this far.
Yeah, we have two profiles for SCIM. We have a SCIM server and we have a SCIM client. That's kind of the rough division of profiles that you get if you read the spec and you just sort of think about it intuitively. But what we're talking about in terms of keeping caches in the relying party up to date, we're now mixing those so that if you can be a client and a server in both sides of the IDP and relying party relationship. And my opinion is that the event like webhook model allows us to stick with clients and servers, and we don't have to make a client into a server or a server into a client. And I think it keeps a more simple set of profiles in that there's just two. You're either a client or you're a server, rather than trying to mingle them. But I mean, haven't completely formulated that opinion and in a way that I could write it down, but I believe that there is some value in keeping the number of profiles really small, like to 2.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too. I'm just going to interrupt this if that's all right, just to do some quick housekeeping before the meeting's over. Is there any last word though? Mark, are you in good shape here from your perspective?
Yeah.
Okay.
We got a good discussion. That achieved my goal. Yay.
Awesome. So just from a logistics perspective, we optionally have IETF 111 in July. It's the 26th, starts the 26th of July. If we want a birds of feather, we have to take action now to get that discussion going. I feel like there's enough interest here and that we have now identified at least 3 drafts that that seem to be valid candidates for possibly revising. It doesn't have to be within the working group. Is anyone here opposed to trying to get a birds of a feather together for IETF 111? Okay, it's an online format. The next opportunity after that is IETF. It is tentatively in person in Madrid. So if we can do a birds of a feather for July, then it means we could look at, that means we'll have to try to come up with a proposed charter to discuss at that birds of a feather, and we could try to charter for Madrid. So I think it's a good clip for us to keep making progress. I think if we don't try for that, then we start to languish. Even if we decide not to charter long-term, I think it's a good forcing function for us to try and get our act together. So please email me if you have any issues with that. Otherwise, we'll push forward. I will put that in writing on the list, and then maybe what we can do is just solicit a separate committee to try to put together some form around that, and then present it back to the group. Okay, cool. I'm excited. We will try and make it so, and then see how life goes. Anything else before we drop off? All right, I will try to get the time right when I notify the list next week. So apologies for that also. Great, I think we're in good shape then.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.